let's get cozy and read about myths and civilization of the Vikings. I found this book at the library. So, let's see what's inside. We have here a helmet, table of contents. Let's see if we can get through 5, 6, 10, and 12 tonight. Let's first begin with the introduction. The Vikings burst onto the stage of European history at the end of the 8th century with the first of a series of devastating raids on Britain and continental Europe. Lasting around 300 years from 800 to 1100 AD, the Viking Age was spectacular and had enormous impact. The Vikings were a restless and daring people. From their rugged homelands in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, they explored Europe, setting up trade links with the Asian, Arab, and North African peoples on its eastern and southern fringes. I didn't know they traded with the Asians, too. They also traveled west, raiding and settling in England, Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, a good 500 years before Columbus. Huh, I didn't know that, did you? The Viking Age had faded by the 13th century as the coming of Christianity changed Scandinavian society, but its rich heritage continues to the present day. Look at this stone artifact here. Let's see. Okay, this is showing how the book works. I tend to skip all of that. Let's see. What is on the next page here? Wow. Look at this amazing illustration. Seems to be a nice sculpture of a man with a cow and humans. This must be the creation myth from the Vikings. Let's read about the birth of the world. It says here, the Vikings believed that the earth was created out of a great empty space called Ginnungagap. To the north of Ginnungagap lay the icy realm of Niflheim, while to the south was Muspel, which was made from flames and fire. Then Ginnungagap was slowly filled with ice from Niflheim. As the ice got nearer to Muspel, it began to melt, and 2 creatures were formed out of it. One was Ymir, the first frost giant, and the other was Adumla, a giant cow. She lived by licking the ice, and Ymir fed on her milk. While Ymir lay sleeping, more frost giants and giantesses grew out of his sweat. One day, Adumla found a huge human-like figure when she was licking the ice. She freed it from the ice and it turned into Barry. He later had a son called Bor. In his turn, Bor had 3 sons who became the first gods. Their names were Odin, Vili, and Ve. The gods hated the frost giants because they were harsh and cruel. They killed Ymir, and made the world out of his body, using his flesh for the earth and his bones and teeth for the mountains and rocks. His blood was used for the seas and rivers, and his skull was made into the dome of the sky, while his brain became the clouds. Bright sparks of fire from a spell were then tossed into the sky to make the sun and moon, and the stars and planets. After this, Odin, Vili, and Ve shaped the first humans from the roots of an ash tree and an elm tree, which they found on the seashore. They called the man Ask because he was made from the ash tree, while the woman was called Embla because she was made from the elm. The gods breathed life into Ask and Embla, and they became the ancestors of all humans. Around the same time, Odin, Vili, and Ve made the dwarfs from maggots that had crawled out of Ymir's flesh, and gave 4 of them the task of holding up the sky. Nothing more is heard of Vili and Ve, but Odin became the most important of all the gods and goddesses. From his home in Asgard, he could see into the future and knew what fate held in store for everyone. He also knew everything that happened in the 9 realms which made up the world, and often traveled in disguise from one realm to another. I do apologize if this candle seems to be flickering a little bit more than usual. I'm not sure why. I just checked and the fan is off and the AC is off. But if it continues, I'll see what's going on. But let's read about, here on this page, religion and burials. So it says here, the Vikings believed in many different gods and goddesses. Some gods, such as Odin and Thor, are well known to us because many myths about them have survived. Others are less well known and their roles and personalities have been lost. The Vikings also believed in life after death. Even the poorest of them were buried with some of their possessions, as well as food and drink, in preparation for their journey to the afterlife. Because they thought that this journey would be over water, many wealthy Vikings had themselves buried in a ship. Others were buried in graves marked out with stones in the shape of a ship. So here we have this artifact. It says here, the giant wolf Fenrir was an enemy of the gods, who kept him bound in chains. But at Ragnarok, the end of the world, the Vikings believed that he would break his chains and devour Odin. Fenrir is shown here in an Icelandic manuscript next to the sacred ash tree, Yggdrasil. I wonder what this manuscript was for. Okay, well, look at this. Okay, so it says the Vikings sometimes sacrificed people on funeral pyres. Whoa. This was done so that the dead person would have someone to help in their life after death. Wow. They were not the first inhabitants of Scandinavia to sacrifice people. This well-preserved body of a man was found by peat cutters in Dolong Bog, Denmark in 1950. He had been ceremonially strangled about 2,000 years earlier. Whoa. That's scary. How is this the actual body? Wow. It's very well preserved. Okay, let's learn about a Viking funeral. In 922, the Arab ambassador Ibn Fadlan watched the funeral of a Viking chief on the banks of the river Volga. He said, "They brought a bier which was placed in the ship. They covered it with Byzantine brocade tapestries and with cushions. They brought fruit and sweet-smelling herbs and laid these beside him. A girl was led to the boat and killed so that she could look after him." Wow. They laid her by the side of her dead master. Then the ship was set on fire. Soon it was burning brightly. First the boat, then the tent, and the man and the maiden, and everything in the boat. The ashes were later buried in a grave mound. It's very fascinating how all of these cultures around the world all share similar customs, and yet they're so different in their own way. Okay. Viking religion. The religion of the Vikings was one of individual worship. There were no temples or priests, and each person asked for personal favors and made their own sacrifices to the gods. The most common animal used in sacrifice was a horse. However, the Vikings were a practical people and either killed a very old horse and then cooked and ate it themselves, or, in the case of a young horse, promised the gods that it would belong to them when it died. Well, that's nice of them at least. The Viking gods. The three most important gods were Odin, Thor, and Frey. Odin and Thor were worshipped throughout the Viking lands, while Frey was worshipped mainly in Sweden. Here are the three gods, Odin, Thor, and Frey. The figures shown on this 12th century tapestry from Skog in Sweden are thought to be, from left to right, Odin, Thor, and Frey. Wealthy Vikings were buried with their jewelry, weapons, tools, clothes, and money, as well as food and drink. Women were sometimes also buried with the whalebone boards and the smooth glass objects they used to flatten out creases in their clothes. Wow, look at this huge boat and all these objects here. A ship burial. The Oseberg ship is the richest Viking burial discovered so far. Buried around 850, it was excavated in 1804. It held a vast array of grave goods and the bodies of two women, one of whom is thought to have been sacrificed to look after the other one in the next life. looks to be somewhat more cheerful than what we have just been reading. It is called here. It is called Heimdall and Human Society. Okay. It says, one day Heimdall decided to visit Midgard. Disguised as a man and calling himself Frigg, he first went to the home of a poor man and his wife. Their names were Ai and Edda, and their tiny house was built from blocks of turf. However, when Rig knocked on the door and asked for food and shelter, they welcomed him in and shared their coarse bread and simple stew with him. Rig stayed with Ai and Edda for 3 nights and repaid their kindness by causing the childless Edda to have a son. He was named Thrall, meaning slave, and in due course he married a woman called Bondmaid, and they became the ancestors of all future thralls. Rig went next to a prosperous-looking farm owned by Elf and his childless wife Amma. When he asked them for food and shelter, they also welcomed him in and fed him on calf stew and other tasty foods. Again, he stayed for 3 nights and repaid their kindness by causing Amma to have a son. This son was called Karl, meaning free man. In due course, he also married and had children. He and his wife became the ancestors of all future Karls. Finally, Rig went to a great hall where a wealthy father and his childless wife, Mother, lived. Again, Rig asked for food and shelter, and here he was entertained with the very best of everything. He stayed for 3 nights and repaid father and mother's kindness by causing her to have a son too. His name was Jarl, meaning Earl, and he grew up to be a wealthy nobleman and the ancestors of all future Jarls. With the 3 classes of Viking society thus created, Rig took on the form of Heimdall once more, and went back to where he came from, and continued to guard the other gods and goddesses from their enemies. Okay, I've never heard of that story before. The Vikings believed that there were 9 different realms arranged on 3 levels. At the top were Asgard and Vanaheim, homes of the gods and goddesses, and Elheim, home of the helpful light elves. In the middle came Midgard, where humans lived, Utgard, home of the giants, Nidavellir, home of the dwarfs, and Svartalfheim, home of the mischievous dark elves. At the bottom were the miserable worlds of Niflheim and Muspel. The 9 realms were held in place by the roots of the giant ash tree, Yggdrasil. Asgard and Midgard were also joined by a narrow bridge called Bifrost. It was guarded by Heimdall, one of the Vanir guards. I'm getting a little confused with all of these names. But here is Heimdall, also known as Rig. And here are the childless couple who will soon have a son. Let's learn about Viking society. society was divided into three groups. At the top were the jarls or earls, then came the carls or freemen, with the thralls or slaves at the bottom. Ah, okay. Now this all makes sense with the previous backstory. But at first there were no real rulers. Instead, the local thing or council laid down the rules and settled any arguments. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, however, some jarls gradually became more powerful than others. These powerful jarls were often known as kings, but at first each one only ruled over quite a small area. When kings started to rule whole countries, the things became less important. Okay, so the thing. The Vikings in Iceland were never ruled by kings. Instead, they had several local things, and the more powerful All-Thing, which met at Thingvellir for 2 weeks every summer. All freemen could attend and vote on the laws, which were recited from the Law Rock. These names are quite amusing. Viking laws. The laws of the Icelandic Vikings were written down in a book called the Jonsbok. Okay. Here we have the Havamal. As well as looking to their things for advice, the Vikings could also be guided by the Havamal, a collection of wise sayings which are supposed to have come from Odin himself. They include, praise no day until evening, no wife until buried, no sword until tested, and no ice until crossed, no ale until drunk, confide in one, never in two, confide in three, and the whole world knows. Never part with your weapons when out in the fields. You never know when you will need your spear, and there is no better load a man can carry than much common sense, no worse load than too much drink. Jarls and slaves. Early Viking society was not rigid. Anyone powerful enough to be a leader or to defeat his rivals could become a jarl, giving other people food and shelter in return for doing heavy work. Most slaves were people who had been captured in raids. Let's learn about the women. Most Viking women were treated better than women in other parts of Europe at this time. They could own and inherit property, whether they were married or single, and they were allowed to marry whoever they wanted. They could also get divorced, they could also get divorced for many different reasons. For example, some women got divorced because their husbands treated them badly, but one divorced her husband because she felt his shirt showed too much of his bare chest. In the home, the wife held the keys to all the storage chests, and if her husband was away, she took charge of the farm and did business on his behalf. She could also intervene in his affairs to keep him out of trouble. Oh, this sounds like a very modern society. Okay, punishment. Occasionally, Vikings were hanged for committing crimes, but more often they had to make a payment to their victim or his family. Those who would not obey the law of the thing could be sent into exile, and if they refused to go, they could be killed. Kings and nobility. By the start of the 10th century, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were ruled by kings. Each king hoped to pass on the crown to one of his sons when he died, so making his family into the ruling dynasty. To be able to do this, however, each king needed the support of the jarls, who made up the nobility. If the jarls did not approve of the new king, they could overthrow him and put someone else in his place. But some Vikings did not approve of kings at all, and many of them went to live in Iceland at this time. The Flateyjarbók. The stories of many of the Viking kings of Norway were gathered together in a huge manuscript known as the Flateyjarbók. Produced in Iceland around 1390, many of its pages are decorated with beautifully painted pictures representing the kings and their adventures. Let's read about Thor and Jormungand. Thor, god of thunder, had vowed to slay the hideous serpent Jormungand. During one of his many voyages, he was staying with the giant Hymir. One morning, as Hymir prepared his tackle for the day's fishing, Thor asked to go out to sea with him. Hymir agreed, and Thor rowed out vigorously to where the giant usually fished. Hymir asked Thor to stop, but the god kept rowing. He took them to where the serpent Jormungand lay with its awful coils twisted about the earth. Thor baited his hook with a bull's head and cast it far out over the waters. The serpent appeared almost immediately, took the gruesome bait in its mouth, and swallowed it greedily. When it felt the hook pricking its throat, it began to thrash about wildly. It tugged so fiercely that Thor's fists were smashed against the boat's gunwales. Thor strained so hard against the line that the bottom of the boat gave way beneath him, and his feet plunged down until they lodged in the seabed. With his boots thus firmly grounded, he began to haul the serpent toward the boat. He fixed the crazed animal with such a look as would freeze a mortal's blood. Just as Thor reached for his mighty hammer to deliver the fatal blow, the terrified Hymir bent forward and quickly cut the line with his fishing knife. The monster fell back into the sea and vanished into the blue depths. Disgusted by his companion's cowardice, Thor dealt with him a fierce blow with his hammer and then set off toward the shore, striding across the bottom of the sea. Thor and Jormungand would meet again during the twilight of the gods. On that occasion, Thor would succeed in defeating his enemy, although it would cost him his life. Look at this huge serpent. And its teeth. And there's Thor. Vikings and sea. The Viking Age was made possible because of the Vikings' superb shipbuilding and seafaring skills. The Vikings became great sailors because they lived within easy reach of the sea and the rugged geography of their homelands made overland travel difficult. An increase in population in the 8th century led to a shortage of good farming land in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and many Vikings began to look to the sea as another way of making a living. At first, they were overseas as raiders, attacking towns and monasteries and stealing their treasures. But later, they went as traders and settlers, traveling further than any other Europeans at that time. So here we have overlapping shields protected the rowers. That's smart. Here is a picture from 1100 showing Viking raiders about to attack the Angers in France in the 9th century. This is a weather vane on the ship's prow which showed the direction of the wind, so the helmsman could keep the sails at the best angle to the wind. On the open sea, Vikings used wooden bearing dials or sun compasses with 32 points to know in which direction they were sailing. This is some sort of a sun compass. Let's learn about the condition of the ships. Strong, light, and fast. Viking longships were flexible enough to sail in rough seas without breaking up. They could also sail in very shallow water and land on a beach without damage if there was no harbor. This was useful when the Vikings went raiding, as it meant they could land wherever they wanted to, often without being seen until it was too late. The ships were also light enough to be lifted out of the water and carried around obstacles such as waterfalls and rapids when the Vikings are sailing on rivers. Trading ships and vessels built to take settlers overseas here were heavier and broader than longships. Trading ships also had a half deck for storing cargo. This is a cross-sectional diagram of a longship, which is narrower and lighter than a trading ship here. Wow. Okay, ornately carved prows finishing in a... Sorry, it's very hard to read with this flickering candle. Finishing in a coiled snake. Reconstruction of the beautiful Oseberg ship found in a burial mound at Oseberg. It was 64 feet long and 15 feet wide. It was probably one of the largest ships of its day. 64 feet long. Wow. It's like, that's on average, like 13 men laying down. Okay, we have the parts of the ship here. Storage for oars here. This is called the stay. This is rigging. The mast. I don't know anything about sailing in ships and boats. That's the sail, okay. And we have the side rudder right here. And these are the oars, that I know. Here we have a basic map of North America and Europe, and what's in between are the Viking lands. Let's read about the Vikings abroad. At first, the Vikings raided towns to England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, France, and what is now the Netherlands. But later, they returned to some of these places as settlers. By 860, they had traveled west as far as Iceland and east along the rivers of Russia to Istanbul. Around 980, they reached Greenland and settled there after 985. From Greenland, they sailed to Helluland, Markland, and Vinland, in what is now Canada, but only stayed for a short while. Viking ships could be either sailed or rowed, depending on circumstances, but the open decks meant that the sailors were often cold and wet. Let's see. Okay, maybe we'll call this the night and learn about Freya and Freyja and the dwarfs another night. And this is all very new to me. I've never heard of these stories, or I haven't learned much about the Vikings in class, in history class, so it was very good to read about this. Anyway, thank you all for joining me tonight. I hope this reading was calming enough to put you to sleep or to help you relax. But if not, if there's any way to improve, just let me know in the comments. I'm always looking to better my videos. I wish you a cozy night, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.